education here, Evan Schwanfeld, and education is a very, very important part of what Egan Maritime does, and of course also museums, and this one in particular. We put together this year 3 talks that focus on what we have as our featured exhibit, which is the endlessly unexpected on lightships. And in fact, this is going to be an absolutely perfect example of certainly something unexpected, and we do feature it in the museum, in the gallery as well. But so the first talk that we had was Karen Butler, who spoke about the evolution of lightship baskets. We're all familiar with those. We've seen them on the arms of maybe your mother, maybe your sister, or maybe your wife, but they don't just appear as lightship baskets or friendship baskets. There is an origin to them, and it has to do with men who were on lightships. Up until 1900, all those baskets were actually made on lightships, but by 1900 the government said, wait a minute, you're working for us. What's this side thing you got going? And so then they moved the making of the baskets to the island. And tonight we have the second one, of course, which is Catherine Rockett, a graduate of Connecticut College, and someone we can really admire, who has a full-time job as a consultant with Robert Curry and Associates, but she's also a night student at Suffolk Law School. And Egan gave her a very tiny, gave her a little bit of funding to help her with her research, and it led to, I think, what will be an exciting night tonight, because she's talking about a topic that is very important in many, many ways. I don't know how many of you read over the weekend that there were raids, and I'm not talking about Florida, I'm talking about New York City, into the Metropolitan Museum, not really raids, but summons and the seizure of assets from a museum because the artifacts had been stolen. And it was the 3rd such incident at that museum. So museums have to know where things came from before they can acquire them and before they can display them. And so in a sense, we're also talking about who owns it, and that's what I think Catherine's going to talk about with us tonight. So we're really, really fortunate to have her. She's done this research on this very interesting, but certainly a topic that all of us, I think, will find extremely valuable. So Catherine, go ahead and let us see what we can own or not own.
Thank you very much, Chuck, for your support throughout this whole process, and thank you, Egan, for having me. It's been a pleasure working with Egan on this presentation, and that research funding was really critical in helping me get those documents from the National Archives. So I guess some of you may know me as Rockett from Egan's ship, The Lynx. And so I've been volunteering with Egan's educational ship, Lynx, for a little while, and that's something that I really enjoy. So I'm putting on a different hat for this presentation, and I'm really excited to tell you about my legal research on this extremely unique case because of the timing, because of the jurisdictional issues, and because of the circumstances under which this wreck and salvage occurred. So I'll be talking to you today about sort of the history of the lightship, the salvage, and the ensuing sort of legal battle, and then I'll also be addressing the applicable law, legal theories, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any sea stories or questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to shoot a hand up or just ask, because we'd love to hear from you. So I'd like to start out with sort of what it was like to live aboard Lightship 117. So these were really, really harsh conditions. You had 11 men on only a 100-foot ship. And so what the function of the lightship was almost like a lighthouse in the middle of the sea. So it was a portable beacon that guarded the very treacherous Nantucket shoals. And the Nantucket shoals were particularly treacherous because they're shifting sands, they're right near the transatlantic shipping channel. And so you've got a bunch of ocean liners and cruise ships coming in from long transatlantic passages that really were in danger of hitting this very small boat. And so the way that ships would navigate towards the lightship and put the lightship in danger were they would either come from England or anywhere around the world, and their first point would be the lightship. And so they would use celestial navigation or dead reckoning when they were traveling across the ocean. And then they would hone in on the radio beacon from the ship. So if you think about it, all these giant ocean liners are coming, pinpointing this small ship, and then at the last minute to get into the channel, they're changing their course. So it was extremely harrowing for these men. But then there were also long periods of almost boredom where you were able to make lightship baskets or carve back in the day. So with that background, I wanted to get into the actual wreck of the ship. So on the day of May 15th in 1934, at about 4 in the morning, the lightship sailors and the captain had a very close call with another ship, the United States ship Paris. And so this giant ocean liner, similar to the next ship that I'll tell you about, they came within 100 feet of the lightship. And like I said, the lightship is only 100 feet long, so it must have been terrifying, the ship careening out of the Nantucket, soup fog that day. So in a very similar circumstance, RMS Olympic, which was Her Royal Majesty's or her former Royal Majesty's ship, was the sister ship of the Titanic, and was a giant ocean liner. And so they were navigating all the way from Southampton, England, and they were going to land in New York City that day. And because of that really dense fog, they reduced their speed from 20 knots to 16 knots as they were, coming up to the transatlantic shipping channel, and they were coming up to the lightship. So they were able to find the lightship's point using that radio beacon, and they slowed down, but they couldn't contact the lightship. So they assumed they had passed the lightship, in that really dense fog, because they heard the lightship's very, very loud foghorn off their starboard side. It turns out they actually had not passed the lightship. And so what the next sort of instance happened was the sailors on the lightship who were on watch, they saw the massive, massive ship with a 90-foot bow, coming out of the fog towards them. And so what the sailors immediately did was they sounded the collision horn and the foghorn and rung the ship's bell. And in the exhibit here, you'll see an interview where one of the men said, "I don't even know how I came up on board. I just jumped off the ship and just did everything in a split second." So at 11:06 in the morning, Olympic actually saw the lightship, and they jammed in reverse, which slowed them from 10 knots to 3 knots, but they still couldn't avoid the lightship. So they rammed them, and within minutes, the ship had sunk. So only 4 men survived, but in the subsequent, maybe 30 minutes or so, the lifeboats were able to rescue some of the rest of the men. And so it was a very quick actual rescue, because they weren't able to see any of the other men, and almost immediately they went right back on their way to New York. So once they arrived in New York, they gave sort of a press conference, and eventually the owners of the Olympic settled with the families of LV-117.
22 hours overdue.
Sorry about that. And so then later on, the owners replaced LV-117 with LV-112. So here's a picture of the sailors that survived. You can see the captain here, Captain Braithwaite. He has a bandage on his head. And so this is the day of the wreck. And when all the sailors arrived in New York, they gave a press conference. And the captain of the Olympic, it's a very reputable ship. It's the sister ship to the Titanic. He elbowed Captain Braithwaite from the podium, and he went on and blustered on and talked about sort of how he tried to avoid the ship and everything. But it was sort of, I think the blame clearly fell on Olympic for not avoiding the lightship. But it sort of speaks to the difference in the size of the ships and definitely the income from the ships. So we'll fast forward about 60 years, and there were 6 men associated with Captain Tukakjian's research vessel Quest. And these 6 men were semi-professional salvagers and divers. And they ended up identifying in 1998 what they believed to be the wreckage of LV-117. So they were using side scan sonars in order to identify the vessel. And so they wrote to the Coast Guard and they said, you know, we think we've identified this wreck and we'd like to dive it and recover some of the artifacts. So they ended up recovering some of those artifacts, and in order to do that, they used an A-frame and a winch and 1,000-pound lift bags. So here's actually a picture of the men with the bell. You can see the Boston Sea Rovers on that. And I wanted to talk about, you know, it was very dangerous for the men when they were on the lightship, but it was also fairly dangerous for the divers when they were diving in the same area. So this is a picture on one of the days that they were diving, and you can see it's very rough seas. I think the black and white adds a little bit of drama, but you're dealing with ripping currents, freezing cold waters, depths of 200 feet, and fishing nets that, you know, are enveloping and entangling the ship. And I wanted to point out too that Egan has a great, behind the screen, Egan has a great exhibit on the Andrea Doria. And the Andrea Doria was another giant shipwreck that's located very close to this. And it's much more popular. It's known as the Mount Everest of scuba diving because of these similar and very, very dangerous conditions. And it's also known as the Mount Everest because of the very impressive death toll of divers. So if you can imagine similar conditions, these semi-professional divers were braving some rough waters in order to recover these artifacts. So one of the funny anecdotes that one of the divers posted on their blog was that as he was diving in, there's supposed to be someone diving behind him. And so he's, you know, cutting nets loose, and some of the buoys are popping up and everything, but he didn't see the diver behind him at all. And so he was wondering where the diver was, but, you know, didn't see any issues and kept working on the boat. Ended up coming up for air, and the men were shocked to see him. And the men were shocked to see him because they said that they saw the biggest shark fin of their entire lives. So these men were braving some very difficult conditions in order to recover these artifacts. Yes?
Rockett, where did the wreck occur?
So it was 50 miles southeast of Nantucket. So right where that transatlantic shipping channel is. And so another thing to point out is that these men were aware of the importance to the families and to the Coast Guard and just of the families and maritime history of this wreck. And so they told the bell 3 times to honor the lives that were lost when they recovered it. So here are some of the artifacts that they recovered. The first one here is the hub of the ship's wheel. You don't see the traditional spokes of the ship's wheel because those were made out of wood, and the wood, you know, has long rotted away. Here's the engine order telegraph and the main light, which looks very similar to some of the lights that you see around here. Over here is the flying bridge compass binnacle stand. I didn't know what that meant, so I had to look it up. What that is it houses the compass on the highest point of navigation in the ship. So that was used to help navigate. And what was interesting to me also was that the divers, they used, you know, on their own time, they restored all of these artifacts to this condition. So I spoke to the captain actually, and he said they put in about 250 hours in order to get the items back to this condition. And I think after 60 years, you know, in the bottom of the ocean, these look pretty good.
Yeah.
This next picture is not of, you know, the restored pilot house or anything, but this is another lightship, 612, which is owned by Bill Golden, and this is what the pilot house looks like. So you can see the, you know, very, very similar conditions of the artifacts to a fully restored and not sunk lightship. So getting into sort of the legal controversies and the meat of this case here, there were several communications with the Coast Guard, and we haven't really talked about the interaction between the Coast Guard and the Lightship Bureau, but before the Coast Guard was the Lightship Bureau. It was the sort of precursor that wrapped into the Coast Guard, but at the time the ship sunk, it was not part of the Coast Guard. But there's questions on sort of jurisdiction and who owns the ship. So the first note and the first sort of communications were from the captain of the research vessel, and he wrote to the head of the Massachusetts Bureau of Underwater Archaeological Resources and sort of, requested, what can we do here? How do we do this search appropriately? We want to sort of, be in line, and also we want to recover these artifacts. So the head of the Bureau of Underwater Archaeological Resources said, we would probably approve this project as long as it's done in conjunction with the Coast Guard. And so then the captain wrote to the Coast Guard, and in his letter to the Coast Guard, he said he wanted to recover the artifacts and he wanted to donate them to the Coast Guard Museum in New London after they, had been restored and maybe had done some further research and lectures or publishing in that area. So here we have a note back from the Coast Guard, and this note's really important. It says several things that would definitely dissuade someone from pursuing, cooperation with the Coast Guard. One of those was there's no funding at all for any research plan. The second was that it would require a lot of interagency collaboration in order to execute the archaeological restoration and everything. And then the other one said it was just an indefinite period of time. So there was no plan, no funding, and there was no way that it could really get done. So that's a bit disappointing. That was in April of 1999. And the men notably did not respond to that letter in any way. Here at the bottom it says, if you want to expedite this process, please send us your sort of CVs or your diving resumes, but none of that was done. And then the next letter came a couple months later, and that was a very strong and harsh letter from the Coast Guard. And it told the men, you may undertake no further action related to the artifacts in this wreck. And that also was not responded to. So as you can imagine, a lawsuit eventually came through. And one notable thing was that prior to this lawsuit, there was correspondence in the actual case file that said that the government declined to prosecute the men because the men had promised to donate the articles to the Coast Guard Museum. But when I spoke to the captain, he said that the divers actually went to New London, across from where I went to school, and looked for a museum. And what they ended up finding out was that some Coast Guard artifacts were being stored in the back room of a kindergarten. So there really was no Coast Guard museum at the time. But there is one currently under construction, and I think, like Chuck said, it may be almost complete. But that was a few years before this, and so the men ended up being served with this lawsuit, and the government sort of threw the legal book at them, and what they alleged were trespass, wrongful possession, negligent conversion, and violation of the National Historic Preservation Act. And then there was several legal factors that we'll go through in a minute that the government cited as special points of consideration. Some of it was the articles remained in the custody of the Coast Guard, the vessel's historic property. Of note is that the bodies of the men were still with the ship, and that jurisdiction is appropriate and under the Coast Guard. So I would love a show of hands just to see what you think would be the right thing to do in this case, regardless of the legal thing. So could you raise your hand if you think that the men should be able to keep the articles? We got one. Oh, a couple. Okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence about it too.
Okay, and then what about if you think the Coast Guard should get them?
I think they should be, definitely think they should be in a museum, not kept for future sale to someone,
Sure.
Even though these gentlemen are doing it, trying to recover the artifacts of the lightship, anything they find should be in a museum or not personal property.
Certainly.
They
And
kind of planned that, right? So they were going to, you said something about they were going to do some lectures, maybe write a book. That's where
Yes.
they were going to get some money to compensate for, obviously, the money they spent in getting this stuff.
certainly. Yes, yeah. And I guess if you think there's a third way or some compromise, and you both think that.
I would argue that you could argue jurisdiction. I mean, this is not, it was owned by the US government. That doesn't mean it was owned by the Coast Guard.
Yes, and we will
It's very
definitely
good.
get into
And
that.
can I take a step back? Did they blatantly disregarded the letters from the Coast Guard then?
Yes.
Right, so the Coast Guard told them no and they went anyway.
Yes, because the Coast Guard said that they did have jurisdiction over that.
Okay.
So I guess we need to look at jurisdiction because that's one of the foundational elements of admiralty and maritime law. So admiralty jurisdiction, it doesn't come from, say, a code, right? There's many different sources, and there's a few different factors that influence who has jurisdiction. So one would be the physical location of the wreck or the artifacts. Another would be if it's in state or federal waters. I think you spoke about that earlier. If something is a historical item or an artifact, or if something's located in international waters, and then if something's a military artifact or item or warship, that also has different rules. So there's a lot of competing things. So the first thing we looked at is where is the lightship located? So when it was operational, and it sunk right where it was operational, it was about 50 miles southeast of Nantucket. So there's different maritime boundaries in these different colors that you can see here. This actually is located in the exclusive economic zone. So we don't need to get into the specific, different designations, but what is of note is that 12 miles is typically seen as state jurisdiction. So this is not directly in state jurisdiction, but there are certain statutes that may extend that jurisdiction. So here are a few of the statutes that I looked at. I wanted to see, well, this certainly seems like an abandoned shipwreck. Does the Abandoned Shipwreck Act apply? And what I found is that this does not apply because that only applies to ships that are located 3 miles offshore. This one, I think the Massachusetts law about the Bureau of Underwater Archaeological Resources that is able to extend jurisdiction through some exception called the Historical Importance Exception to Prima Facie Abandonment. That's a mouthful, but that's probably the most applicable statute here, because what that says is that even if a wreck is not located within state waters, the jurisdiction of the Bureau can be extended if the item is located in or around said resources, which means state waters. So there is not a lot of precedent in that area. So this is one of the factors that make this sort of a new question of admiralty law, but that may apply. And so these things all go together, state jurisdiction and the Massachusetts laws. And then in the lawsuit, the Coast Guard mentioned a violation of the National Historic Preservation Act. And so this location jurisdiction actually is determined by whether or not the shipwreck and the ship were abandoned by the federal government. So if this property is a historical property and currently owned or controlled by the federal agency, then it would fall under the National Historic Preservation Act. So we'll go into the National Archives and the actual bill, but that may apply. So another really important concept in admiralty law is abandonment. And basically that is significant because if properties are abandoned, then the finders and the salvers and people like the divers are more likely to get title to those artifacts or shipwrecks. So here are the laws that apply to abandonment and the different definitions. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but I think I did a pretty circumspect analysis of the laws that apply. And so the biggest jurisdictional hook and matching definition of abandonment is through actually the Constitution. So in Article 4, Section 2, the Constitution requires explicit abandonment of federal property or government-owned property. So this, at the time, the Lightship Bureau was under the Department of Commerce, I believe. And so they would have had to explicitly abandon it for the divers to get any, abandonment or for any of those laws to apply. So all of these, are tangentially related. Again, in the historical importance exception, that also may apply because it's in or around state waters. But my sort of lay opinion is that the 12 miles of state jurisdiction, it's a long stretch to say 50 miles is also, in or around those waters. And then the Sunken Military Craft Act, this was a civilian ship at the time, so that does not apply. Later, when the Coast Guard assumed ownership, this would probably apply. And then there's sort of a tangentially related possible definition of abandonment under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and that says if the shipwreck is a danger, because of pollution, you might be able to say, salvers are able to take these things from the ship because it could be a danger to other ships, but I really don't think it was a danger given that it was, 200 feet down and it had been there for 60 years. So like I said, the most critical abandonment definition and jurisdictional hook is through the Constitution, which says we need explicit abandonment for the divers to be able to get the artifacts from the ship. And so I looked at this in pretty great detail, and when the ship was commissioned in 1931, the Lightship Bureau was under the Department of Commerce, so not Coast Guard, right? It sinks in 1934, and then it merges with the Coast Guard in 1939. So I looked and this is where Egan helped me fund my research with the National Archives. And the National Archives gave me literally thousands of documents related to the drafting of the bill, the intent behind the bill, and everything to see if there was any intention for the Coast Guard to assume the liabilities and assets of the Bureau, or if anything was explicitly abandoned, because we're trying to find that explicit abandonment. So here's what I found. I went through these thousands of pages and highlighted the important parts because it would be a very long presentation. I went through all of them. And so, like we're saying here, if we get explicit abandonment, then the men may be able to claim title. And so I think unfortunately, there's no real clear statement of whether or not a sunken lightship is abandoned in the merger. So what I think, and I would love to hear your opinions on it as well, is that by abolishing the Bureau of Lighthouses and all of the functions, I think that abandons any artifacts or any non-active functions. And so the care of a sunken lightship was not an active function. And so, it's not saying that this lightship is not property anymore, but it's sort of abandoning and abolishing that relationship. So I think that's what I have, and I'm kind of going to leave it open to interpretation or comments. Yes.
All right, the owners of the Olympic replaced the Nantucket.
Yes.
Did they get ownership of the sunken ship? They
think-
actually paid and placed the boat,
Yes.
But has it ever been determined if they took ownership of the sunken boat?
So there were no claims to title of the sunken boat, which lends to an interpretation of abandonment, there was no salvage attempts until these men came in 1998. So I think they, and they also, if it was, a Spanish ship with lots of gold in it, there may be more insurance claims and things like that, but these items are historically valuable, but not financially valuable.
So I think Olympic was owned by Cunard, right?
So actually, at the time, it was owned by the White Star
Oh,
Line,
White Star,
and then they
right.
merged with Cunard, maybe right around, I think, the time that the merger happened with the Bureau. Yes.
I have a question about the 12 miles and the 50-mile jurisdiction.
Yes.
So if the wreck occurs, or the collision occurs at the 50-mile mark, but currents take the wreck further afield than the 50 miles, does that change who gets jurisdiction of it, or does that change how it's viewed from a legal perspective?
So I think if it brought it inland within state waters, then the state would have a better claim to it, and the Massachusetts Bureau could definitively say, this is within Massachusetts waters, you can't touch it. If it brought it out beyond 200 miles, which would be a little bit difficult for a sunken ship, but if it brought it into international waters, then I may have to phone a friend and ask my Admiralty Law professor, but I think that's sort of more open to salving, and the federal government may not have.
And what was the depth of the wreck?
200 feet.
200 feet.
So which is the same as the Andrea Doria. Yes.
What was the motivation for the Coast Guard to come out so strong?
Well, I think in their suit, they cited the bodies of the men who had served and lost their lives. And I think that's such an important thing. These men lost their lives in service of what then was the Lightship Bureau and then became the Coast Guard. That's a really sensitive area. And the living was so difficult on these, and you had so many brave men that I think there was a lot of pushback maybe within the Coast Guard community when people read the blog post of the men saying, we did this awesome thing, we ripped these artifacts from the wreck of the ship and brought them up, and now we're putting them in a museum, or sort of on our traveling display. So there was some outrage there, but
I would have thought it would be a precedent thing that they don't want people diving Pearl Harbor, for example. And if you're allowed to dive this where people died, then why can't you dive the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor, which would create huge problems?
So that is the abandonment thing, right? So it wasn't part of the Coast Guard, it was part of the Department of Commerce.
Oh,
and
right.
so if they did abandon the ship by saying we abolish the functions of the Lightship Bureau and transfer anything else to the Coast Guard, then it's sort of open territory, right? But
So
if they
does
did-
Coast Guard fall under military?
yes, for purposes of ships and things, yeah.
When you were researching all of the documents, was there something specifically said by the acquiring entity that they didn't want any of the liability
So that's what I was,
of the Department of Commerce?
there's hints at that, right? So they
Nothing
say
specific.
nothing specific, but in all of the documents of people, secretaries of treasury writing back and forth to each other, the biggest tagline that I saw was, we're going to save money, we're going to, create economies of scale, we're going to reduce duplicative expenditures and vessels. So the intent of it was to really make a more concerted effort and unified body doing those functions. And so they did discuss a lot of the things that did transfer. A lot of it had to do with the men and their sort of time cards almost, and how you're going to merge a civilian organization into a military or quasi-military one. But they really did not discuss ships, or they said that the current Coast Guard lightship stations were to be merged with Coast Guard stations, but they didn't discuss anything that was underwater or not in use.
Interesting.
Did the captain of the rescuers, the divers, say why they didn't respond to the Coast Guard letters?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I was able to speak to him, but this lawsuit, there is no law that came out of it because it settled, and so we don't really know. It settled. So there's
How did it settle?
so we don't know, right? It's
Oh.
it's a private settlement between the divers and the Coast Guard. What we do know is that the divers do not have the artifacts anymore.
That was a question of where are the
Where are the
artifacts
artifacts
now?
now?
Yeah.
They're in the Coast Guard.
Somewhere with the Coast Guard, but we don't know, and I'd love to take a trip back down to the New London Coast Guard Museum and see, but I don't think they're displayed yet or anything.
Wow.
So they've sat for quite a while, and the public hasn't seen them.
And did historians, were the historians frustrated that they restored the articles? Because sometimes people might want to see them as they were when they came out of the water.
So I
don't know.
I think a lot of those articles, there were barnacles all over them. They were kind of smashed up and dirty. These men have done work. Some of the men have done work for National Oceanographic or National Geographic, doing that same restoration work. So those would be the people who are sort of the experts in that field on restoration. But I think that is definitely an issue with different history, and I think the Whaling Museum had a good blurb on that as well.
I have a rather sort of tangential question, maybe for later, but how was the ownership determined of, say, the Titanic or the SS Central America, which were, the gold ship that went down on the way back from Panama, that with tons of gold in it? It went down, it wasn't owned by the military, but presumably the insurance companies could lay claim and all of that.
So salvage and fines law.
Obviously, I'm not on this, but I'm fascinated in how that works.
Oh, so salvage and fines law, there's different sort of jurisdictional and maritime standards for what's considered a find and what's considered salvage. Those would be a sort of finder's law, and I think in some of the Spanish gold or different types of gold and treasure cases, the proceeds are split if there's no renunciation of title or ownership. So you don't know where the ship is, but the insurance company, has, I guess, a very long open claim. They sometimes split between the people who find it and the owners through the insurance companies.
And the states.
Okay,
The state takes a very large percentage of those fines, especially in Florida, when they found all that gold and all. The state has
and so I think that was
jurisdiction.
embedded state lands, that was the classification of that jurisdiction.
I don't know, but I know that the state receives generous portions of the fines.
Okay. Yes.
When you get your law license, if I get in trouble, will you work for me?
I would be honored.
I have a rowboat.
So a question that came up today was that the Brant Point Lighthouse is in really bad shape.
Yes.
Has the government ever been accused of abandoning something like that on land? Do you know, or?
I think it would be very hard to argue that, because you need probably explicit abandonment or, I mean, even if they wash the windows once every 10 years, I think that would, or every 5 years or something, that would say the government has not abandoned it.
Okay.
But that's still run by,
It's still run by-
still controlled by
Yeah.
Coast Guard, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was going to go in yet another direction. Let's say you were on the links, and the links ran aground, and I happen to have a boat that can pull the links off, and I'm just hanging around the hoop. What would you say to me as a lawyer?
So, actually, my admiralty professor specializes in this, and as soon as possible, execute a contract saying the reasonable price of salvage and what someone, stipulate, here are my hours, here are my rates, and the captain of the links can agree to that or reject it. If they reject salvage, you can't go and salvage the boat, even if you think it's in the best interest, right? So the captain has the authority to say, you can save us, you can't save us.
So basically, you wouldn't accept my line until we had agreed to the salvage. I mean, like if I said I'll throw you a line, attach it, I'll just pull you off.
So that's what happens a lot of the time, but the best practices would be to even say, just sign a piece of paper with both names and a dollar amount. But often, you're in distress, you figure it out later, and they benchmark the price based on what a reasonable salver would do at the time.
Well, Seatow does that all the time, and that's their main business, so I don't think there would be a claim on the boat if they salvage the boat. Oh, yeah, see, but a lot of those Seatow people, you're in contract with
Your
Seatow.
contract.
Because
you
you sign up
sign
for it,
sign
you
something.
pay,
You
which
tow
was,
that you can just radio them.
Yeah, you have to sign a contract.
Right, with
with
Seatow, yeah.
It's interesting that one time our boat, which is in Nantucket Harbor on the mooring, broke off the mooring and came ashore at the creeks. And the mooring company said, don't let Seatow or wherever do it. The Seatow called me and said, would you like us to take your boat off the sand? And I had thankfully talked to the mooring company. They said, don't let them do it because they'll charge you a salvage rate.
oh, true, yeah.
And so I thought that was pretty interesting.
So what did you do?
The guys who own the mooring company came in at high tide and just pulled it off.
Oh, okay.
So because it was their mooring and the line broke, it parted, believe it or not, polypropylene line that thick. But anyhow, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
But presumably you could say to Seatow, I'm happy to have you pull me off, but what's the deal?
How much?
Which you could either accept or reject.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I never got that.
that
far.
happens a lot, but it's,
It would be hard to
Do they?
know
Yeah.
what.
the people don't have contract with them before they tow, say, how much you gonna charge me
Yeah.
to take it off?
We
My
never got
boat.
that far.
But
How
if you
much
don't
you
think-
gonna charge me, my boat,
Right,
But
yeah.
if you don't
Take
think you have
it
another option, you might just say, I guess I
Yeah,
have
if
to
you're
do
you're
it.
ignorant about it, I mean, you just
Yeah.
say, oh yeah, thank you very much. I
Uh-huh.
want you to save my boat.
So my question, so we're obviously sitting, you're right behind the Andrea Doria, and a lot of people have gone down and done that. Are they salvaging, or what is, because it's a private boat and it's not associated with the military, how can divers take the treasures and then claim?
Actually, there are people who claim title to it now, have been given title to that
Okay.
ship, so you can't just randomly
You
go
can't
down
just
there and take
go down
something.
and take
Yeah.
something.
And I think you even have to request, maybe I found this, like pottery or something, I want this, and then you have to notify other people, something, there's a
And
big
you notify
process behind it.
Probably the owners, the original owners of the ship, or?
Well, they no
insurance
longer, because
company.
they,
Yeah.
yeah,
is the owner.
just
Okay,
because,
interesting.
yeah.
Once they pay a claim, they own the boat.
Yeah, the boat, interesting.
If I can turn it to the museum, if everybody looks back here, there is a shipwreck in 1851. Evan knows this one very well. He's told the story in podcasts. 1851, there's a captain on there with Irish immigrants. And they wrecked off of Tuckernuck. And it takes all night for the wreckers, that is people who made their living by salvaging or by under implied or real contract, to save assets from ship owners or for whoever owned the cargo. So David Patterson and his brother have two separate ships, and you can see one there. Why do I forget the name?
It's the Hamilton and the Gamecock.
The Hamilton and the Gamecock.
Yep.
The Hamilton is coming alongside the British Queen, which is the name of that ship. And the first thing Captain David Patterson does is he hollers at the captain, "Hey, what do you got aboard?" And the captain says, "Well, I have 246 starving Irish immigrants, no insurance, and we want to know if you're going to rescue us." And David Patterson makes the decision not to be a wrecker, but to be in the tradition of Nantucketers, to start rescuing, along with the Gamecock, every single person off of that ship, all 246 of them, and bring them to Nantucket, where they're kept in private homes and in churches and what have you for 1 week, and then all but one couple continue their journey through New Bedford and all the way to New York. That one couple, I have to tell it so that it relates still to Nantucket, that's Julia and Robert Mooney, who had been married just before that ship left Ireland. And we don't know the real story, what they said, but you can imagine Julia said something like, "Hey, we were headed for America, right? We've reached America. If you think I'm getting on another ship," and they stayed here, and their grandson becomes the chief of police of Nantucket, and the great-grandson becomes a legislator, a lawyer and a legislator in Massachusetts. And we were able to display the actual quarterboard from that ship, which the family has kept because it washed aboard and people gave it to them. We have the quarterboard temporarily anyway in our collection, but not on display. So sorry to take a side thing for your, but I think it's applicable.
Could you explain that a little more? He shouted, "What do you have on board?"
Something like that, you know, sort of like, "Hey, here we are. What's going
You had to
on?"
declare as a salvager whether you were going to be a salvager or a rescuer?
Well, I think the
They were going out as
implication was they were
salvagers.
hoping there was cargo,
Yeah.
and they could claim the cargo. I'll take the cargo off, and then I'll rescue you.
And they said, "All we have is starving
All we
people."
have is starving Irishmen, so.
Okay, gotcha.
And the salvaging was a huge business on Nantucket, especially after whaling. All the ships that wrecked were cargo that washed ashore and things, and the salvagers they were competitive with each other. They were also very good
Very
friends
much so.
with the insurance underwriters, who were also all around, who kind of dealt with the legalese of all these claims. So there was a
Lloyd's
lot
of
of-
London had a representative here for
Yeah.
most of the 19th century.
Really?
Yeah.
But a lot of the wrecks were used, the ships wrecks themselves, the actual planks and all that, were used to build houses.
Oh,
in
correct,
Nantucket.
right. Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, because there's no trees here. You know,
That's right.
on that.
Yeah, no, it's
repurposed.
But if that guy had said, "I have gold on board and starving Irishmen," would they have said, "Well,
After I have the gold, I might
after
look
I
at
have
the
the gold,
Irish."
I'll take the Irishmen"?
No, they're Nantucketers. They definitely would have taken the Irishmen first.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That's a 21st century interpretation. Very charitable.
Well, thank you.
Can I ask you can you go back to the picture of the rescued people? Yeah, that's looks just like the Titanic's,
Oh, the Grand Staircase. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's on the Olympic.
yeah, I know, but I'm saying,
Yes.
it's sister ship.
Well, the Olympic was built first, actually. It's the Olympic class. Olympic, Titanic,
Britannic.
and Britannic.
Actually, a fun story about that ship is that, after the shipwreck, they were operational for a few years, but they ended up becoming a hospital ship during the war.
Yeah, it was sunk off of Spain.
And the crazy thing that they did when it was a hospital ship is they had to paint it in camouflage. And so it essentially looked like a zebra after being the beautiful, Titanic looking ship. And they had these crazy, like zebra white stripes. I think it was either purple or black or something. But it went on means
It
that
was sunk,
it
yeah,
was
sunk
sunk.
off of Spain or between Africa and Portugal.
But that's very observant of you to notice that
I
too.
know.
Yeah, I know, I mean,
That's cool,
the banister there.
Yeah, yeah.
Makes me wonder whether they cheaped out on navigators at the White Star Line.
Right.
With both Titanic hitting an iceberg in
I
this.
know.
Yeah, you couldn't find an iceberg to hit that at us.
That's my next research project.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was-
Yeah.